Welcome back. I'm Dr. Christian von Lahr and Messenger, and today we have our special guest, Susan Miller. Now, we promised you something very interesting. The ancients might have lost some of the wisdom about astrology. Not sure what the expert's opinion is going to be, but we have all of these ancient stories indicating that they were travelers, and they would take some wisdom, like from Babylon to Egypt. There was a Chaldean influence. There were all these battles and wars, so we're not sure what we ended up with. So I'm kind of confused. Did we lose the wisdom? Is it hidden somewhere? Are we going to discover more?
Well, it's amazing how much did survive.
Well, now that's going to be good. Okay.
Astrology started at 2500 BC. In the beginning, there were more than 12 signs. Mm-hmm. There were many, and they had to condense them down, and there were overlapping constellations, so they had to really delineate
So
them.
That's actually the age or the time that Hinduism started, by the way.
Oh yeah, really?
Okay.
Yes.
Which is interesting, since all the philosophers and even Paracelsus actually wandered in the desert just like Jesus, going to the east looking for wisdom.
Really?
So did it start in the east also?
Well, we think of Mesopotamia, Babylonia, the Chaldeans. Those are where the real cradle
So
of
sort of
this
Persia.
began, you know. But we do know that different cultures were sprouting up with somewhat similar ideas. You know, when you think about astrology, think of no cities like we have now, because we can't
I
even
think this
see
is
the
going to be an
stars.
interesting topic.
Okay, think of shepherds, you know, with their sheep sitting on a hilltop, and they're bringing their sheep in. It's now twilight. They can see the stars and the planets, and they can see meteors. They can see comets. They can see eclipses. Of course, they
Let me add one thing. I bet they were seeing a consistency and a pattern.
Well, they were. They didn't know what was important and what wasn't, so they were writing it all down. And they were doing what anybody would do, empirical research. And especially with the eclipses, they were seeing, because those are so dramatic, you see, you know, definite events as a result. But also, there were no calendars. It's really hard to imagine this. So the farmers were the first to use the sky as a big calendar. They knew when to sow the land, when to reap the crop.
So for agriculture,
yes.
Interestingly, you just talked about Mars being associated with agriculture. Okay.
They were paying attention to the phases of the moon, and they knew when to pick the crop because they couldn't leave it on the vine too long. So they were using the sky as a calendar.
It's interesting because when you look at history, we kind of think of knowledge as being power too. Did that occur with astrology?
Well,
or was it always practical?
Well, it was, first of all, something that had access to kings and very rich families. Because if you were going to have an astrologer, you had to have a mathematician, because astrology is based heavily in math. So the professor in the university in the region of the kingdom is who you'd have to summon. And heads of state always wanted to know, what if? What am I not looking at?
So they really believed in this.
Oh, absolutely.
And they knew that it was going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So they were running their kingdoms back then based on astrology.
The Egyptians really put it on the map. It was coming up, but they really, you know, organized it.
Is that because they had, it was, you know, like 3 kingdoms in Egypt. It was like a 14,000-year-old civilization. So they had a lot of time to keep that continuity going.
They did, and then the Romans loved it too. A lot of people felt, well, the minute it got to Islam had developed the decimal point, and they thought, well, there goes astrology, that's going to die. But instead, astrology got more accurate because, remember, astrology is not about predicting things so much as opportunity for planning or knowing when adverse events may come up and how to, you know, be ready to deal with them, and opportunity. It's not just bad things, good things too.
But it presumes that certain alignments or planets have a latent potential.
Yes.
Okay. And so we can actually use the latent potential in a predictive way or possible predetermined way, but we're still allowed to vary it in some way.
Absolutely, because we have free will.
So if we do nothing,
sometimes you still feel it.
We know the default. Basically.
Look, if you have a tough aspect coming, and like last September, I had written on on Astrology Zone that I had never seen so many tough aspects packed
Mm-hmm.
into such a tiny envelope of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the happy person, so even the media paid attention to that little paragraph that I had written. I was surprised, and I don't cry fire in a theater ever. I always tell my readers, okay, if some tough things are coming, this is what you're going to have to be prepared to deal with. And September was hard in that the universe was going to ask you, what do you want to do about this? Quickly. You weren't going to have a lot of time to think about it. And so I said to my readers, don't have a lot on your schedule. This is one of those months where things come at you pell-mell.
So this is the example of taking an ancient wisdom that had been proven over time, and Susan's indicating she's actually given us some advice in advance for large groups and populace to take advantage of.
Oh, absolutely.
It caught on. Let's hear the rest of that
Well,
story.
well, see, I have a theory about why astrology has made it all the way to us now.
And you think it's actually not changed that much. And
Not too much.
I was kind of concerned that it might have changed
Well,
and been lost by those Persians.
You know,
that they were battling and
well,
civilizations were moving.
all the signs are associated with certain stories, like Persephone or the Minotaur, or the lion, the Neiman lion, and people in ancient days knew those stories, like we know baseball scores, and
Right.
so it was sort of shorthand, like if they
They were
would.
metaphors in a way, right?
Yeah, so they would mention the myth, and people would say, "Got it, know it. You don't even have to tell me the myth. I know it." And
And just to clarify, myth actually was not something that was not true. It was simply something not necessarily known by everyone or something to be discovered.
or that crystallized
Right.
traits that
Yeah.
were there, and that really, through a story,
Wow.
showed you the fullness of those traits in a way you couldn't understand it by a simple sentence.
Okay. So where are we going to take this
Yeah.
myth concept? How were they using that?
Well, I started studying the myths, and when I was writing Planets of Possibilities, I didn't want to come out with another astrology book that was just like everybody else's, because you already knew a lot of the traits. You probably had a few books on your shelf already. So for 4 years, I studied all the different myths. First, I wrote a chapter about you and put in, each of the 12 signs about each, characteristic that was unknown or latent in you that you might not have known before. But then I added a second chapter for all 12 about the myths associated with that sign, like Sagittarius, the wise man Chiron, who lived in a cave on top of the mountain. He had been hit by an arrow in his hip, and Sagittarius rules the hip, but he didn't die because he's immortal, he just couldn't walk.
Right.
So he lived in this cave, and he meditated, and he was known as the great wise man, and people would make this pilgrimage up to the top of the mountain to see him. But they would be changed after, and it was an arduous trip, but it was worth it.
Something's going on up here. There's also stories and myth of things like the 12 trials of Hercules.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of these zodiac signs
And that's lion.
and these myths.
That's Leo.
This is going to come together, isn't it?
Yes, and Hercules wears the skin of the lion, which is the theatrical side of Leo.
I didn't know that. Okay.
And he comes back wearing it, and everybody's afraid of him. But he wears the skin, and he becomes so courageous. And Leo can put on the costume and become what they want to be.
So the ancients, when we study the ancient wisdom, we indicate that the progress of humans' consciousness goes through these 12 trials of like Hercules. And it's also why we have the age of Aquarius and the age of Pisces in that sense, because the consciousness of man is actually going through a phase or change that everybody's going through. And this actually fit into astrology on the signs you're born under also?
Yeah.
Are you getting aligned with that again or something?
Well, there's a lot of misconception about astrology because most people come to it through the newspaper. Actually, that started in the 30s when the newspapers wanted to increase their circulation. They came to the astrologers and said, "Could you write a column every day?" And the astrologer said no. And the editor said, "No, why not?"
I was about to say, I remember that, then he goes, "No, don't do that."
Well, I heard about this, and they said, well, it's not just the sun sign. Your rising sign is equal of importance, and then of course you have the 8 planets, and you know, we're all a rich tapestry of what was happening in the sky at the moment of our birth. And did you know no 2 charts are identical ever? Not back in Cleopatra's time, not in 5,000 into the future.
Yeah, I know.
It
A
will
lot of
never
people
be
think that there's
repeated.
like 12 different variations if you're into astrology, and it's just not true. You have all
No,
the
no,
variations.
you're really unique,
Yeah.
and that's why you must express your creativity, your point of view,
Right.
your perspective, because it'll never be created again.
Now, you said something just a moment ago, rising signs, and I think you're going to answer
I
a
need to.
question I've always been wondering. I have found that the rising signs pretty much define me in the earlier part of life, and then it starts changing to the actual sun sign. Is that just me, or is there a time when the rising sign is more important for people?
Well, actually, that's a good question. First, I should define it. The rising sign is the sign that was on the eastern horizon as you were being born. It was the constellation that was most dominant. And it is the sign that you take on naturally to express yourself in life.
It's like the personality.
Your
ego,
personality.
perhaps, yeah.
You know, it's why all Aries aren't alike or all Scorpios aren't alike. You are a combination of the two, unless you're born at dawn. And you know, dawn changes. Like in the summer, it's early, and in January it comes up late, but it doesn't matter. You have to do a chart to know your rising sign, and you must know your precise time of birth. But it never changes, so it's worth having your chart done once. Or I have these books called My Personal Horoscope.
Which we can get at astrology.
Yeah. Well, it's
zone.com.
on my other side,
Okay.
mypersonalhoroscope.com. But we ask the reader to put it in themselves, so there's no mistakes. You know, we don't want to have too many people in the pipeline. You know, there could be an error. And then we print a book just about you. It's actually a bound book. It takes 2.5 weeks, and it costs $49 plus you know, shipping. But anyway, once you know your rising sign, you must read for that as well as your sun sign for the rest of your life. And if you say read my column, you'll get pretty much 85% of what's coming up without having to go to an astrologer.
This is great. We're going to come back and talk about this because I have another question about that combination. You've been watching A Messenger. Susan Miller is our guest. And when we come back, we're going to finish up this topic and also start broaching an interesting subject important today, 2012.